Good morning, everyone. My name is Chitra Rajeshwari, and I'm the Executive Director with Avasant Foundation. As Nicole mentioned, the IOP has numerous chapters, one of which is the IOP's Women Empowerment chapter. The IOP started its Women Empowerment chapter to learn about the perceptions of gender equality, empowerment, and opportunities for women in the outsourcing industry, and in turn share knowledge with its members on the realities of women empowerment in our industry and how we can overcome the obstacles around gender inequality. This chapter was started in 2016, and we're very proud to say that for this year, this is our second webinar related to this, related to women empowerment issues and initiatives. With that said, I would like to introduce you to Jolene Shoemaker, a recognized international policy and women's leadership expert. Jolene is a fellow at Our Secure Future Women Make the Difference program of the One Earth Future, where she promotes women in decision-making and gender analysis in global peace and security. Today's topic, as Nicole mentioned, is reaching our leadership potential, gender equality in an interconnected world. Jolene will touch on the critical linkage between gender equality and global innovation, security, and prosperity, the common obstacles for women, male allies, and organizations to achieve gender equality goals, and the transformative role of networks for women's empowerment and leadership. Once again, when Jolene finishes her presentation, please post your questions on the chat box, which is on the bottom of your screen, on the bottom toolbox of your screen. With that said, I will hand it over to Jolene.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be joining you all for this webinar today. I'm going to see if I can go ahead and share my slides up here. Since the only unfortunate thing is that we can't see each other, so I thought that this may be a helpful way for us to for you to follow kind of visually what I'm planning to cover. Thank you, first of all, to Chitra for the nice introduction, and to Nicole and Dana. I'm really happy to learn about your organization and your efforts in terms of promoting gender equality. So what Chitra previewed and what I thought we would do during our time together today, talk a little bit about the sort of big picture on gender equality, its linkages with a lot of different aspects of our future, and then touch on some of the common obstacles that we're seeing across industries and sectors to achieve gender equality goals, and then sort of pose the question of where we go from here. And one thing I would like to say is please do share your questions. Don't feel that you have to wait to the end of me talking, and I can get very passionate about these issues and and talk quite a bit about them, and I don't want you to feel like you have to wait until the end. Everyone's going to be monitoring the questions as well, so if I don't see the questions, then someone else will pipe up, I'm sure, on this webinar and let me know, but I'm happy to address questions along the way. So please feel like it's as much of a conversation as we can have on this type of platform. So first of all, why women? So I've been working on gender equality for about 15 years. As Chitra said, my background is more in the foreign policy and national security space. So obviously, still very male dominated, especially on the defense and security side. And so we've really been grappling with gender equality challenges for a long time, and we have some glimmer of hope that things are starting to move forward in a positive direction. But one of the things that as advocates of gender equality, we continue to be asked on a regular basis in almost every single meeting we attend to try to push for change is why women, what besides the human rights arguments and what we all know about fairness, why is it so important for us to prioritize in organizations to make sure that we have gender equality? Why should this not be just a nice to do issue, but lower on the list of to dos for organizations? So increasingly, we're seeing the evidence is clearer and clearer about the powerful impact of gender equality and the equally powerful impact of gender inequality. So we do know now that gender equality is a key economic driver. So not only in our organizations is it really important, but it's really important in terms of a global and regional, these very sort of big shifts and big picture economic drivers. It has been called, and you may have seen this before, the gender dividend. Meaning that investing in gender equality yields primary and secondary effects that are very, very important and critical and powerful. So it's really something that organizations cannot afford to ignore or put on the back burner. The second thing is we do now know from empirical evidence as well that gender diversity leads to better decision-making processes and outcomes. And that is something that has been researched on a variety of fronts. You all may have seen many studies that have articles and so forth. It seems like one is coming out almost every week now or every month and being shared via social media and so forth. Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, Deloitte, a lot of the big companies have come out with pretty big studies on this aspect. And then, lastly, but not by far probably the most important thing is because these common powerful effects are visible across industries and countries and regions. We really know that gender equality will continue to be a key factor in determining the collective future of not only our communities, our families and communities, but our country and the planet. So it couldn't be a more important topic that we're talking about today. So just to drill down a little bit more on what we're looking at, there's a lot of different research and findings out there. I'm just highlighting a few things that I thought would be of interest to this group. There's a correlation between more women in leadership positions. So this is an argument for more women at the C-suite level, more women in top positions, that those companies are more profitable as a result. That is both on the board of directors and in senior executive roles. The board of directors there has been some recent research showing very clear implications for returns, stock performance, dividends, etc. And then, of course, something that we're all very much watching and wanting to contribute to innovation, right? And so innovation, research and development, innovation, we've also seen quite a bit of evidence now that that is really affected by the diversity on teams, bringing different backgrounds together. this is very apparent in the work that I do because we are grappling with very difficult challenges in peace and security. They transcend borders. They transcend organizations. We need to find ways to work together to have creative solutions be put on the table to work through some of these things in more innovative ways. And we are finding that gender diversity is one of the key aspects of making that innovation successful. And then one of the key correlations that I work a lot with is the recent research that has been done on peace and security. And so we've sort of known anecdotally for a long time that it was important to include gender sensitivity and include women at the table in terms of bringing peace and prosperity to communities and countries. But again, we kept being asked again and again, well, what do we know about what that impact could be? And so there has been a variety of studies. If you're interested in this, I know it's a little outside of your sector, but there are more and more academics looking at these things. And there's an academic out of University of Texas who's done these studies that have found an absolute direct correlation between gender equality in a country and peace and prosperity and stability. And she's found the opposite as well. Countries that repress women, countries that do not give women equal opportunities, where women are falling behind, are those countries that tend to be have much higher rates of violence and tend to get in a conflict within their countries and in conflict with other countries. So it's just gave you a broader piece that what we're talking about at the organization and at the business level has these big repercussions on the world we live in. So it is very key. So in some of these are just a few examples that I think are very powerful, and I thought I would share with you. So one of the things in my work, we've worked with women around the world who are not only civil society activists, but business owners, entrepreneurs, government officials, etc. And one thing that is common, despite all different cultures and backgrounds, is that women continuously bridge divides. And those divides can be political, they can be economic, they can be social, they can be cultural, but women are able and have demonstrated this time and time again to bring people together for common goals that are important for their communities and society. They are able to create openings for dialogues and compromises. And this is really important for the business world. And one of the things is that I think one of the very interesting things is to sort of see that this happens in really dangerous situations. This happens where I've worked with a woman named Betty Bigombe from Uganda who actually went out to the bush and, had guns pointed at her by warlords. And she said she worked with them to lay down their arms. So this has happened again and again, and the reason I bring it up is because if women can do this when a shotgun is pointed at them, when there are rampant arms, when there are deep-seated conflict and mistrust, if they can negotiate ceasefires, which we've seen, then we can do it in the other sectors where we're not risking our lives. We absolutely can do this. We can empower and we can support women in these roles. We've also seen sort of, this is again more on the security side, women in military and policing provide greater security for everyone. You know, definitely improve that trust building and so forth. And then we've seen on the political side, more women's participation expands the policy debate. And women bring other things to the table that just aren't getting to the table if women are absent. And I think that the same is true whether you're talking about negotiating peace, or you're talking about negotiating a merger, or you're talking about a sale, or anything else that's going on in the business world. Women and these diverse perspectives and approaches are really, really important to include and to nurture. And then we know now that more women in the labor force on equal levels, it lowers our overall poverty rates, leads to higher economic growth. That's that gender dividend. And that women repeatedly and consistently invest in families and communities, which benefits the entire community and country. So if we know all of this, and we now know all of it, where are the women? What's going on? And I think we all instinctively, and just from what we see around, know the answer to that question. I would say that we have a little bit of a mixed picture going on right now. On the positive side, we have a record number of women obtaining higher degrees and participating in the workforce. More and more women are the breadwinners for their households. So we've got definitely this growing influx of women in the workforce, right? And women are rising through the ranks. And so we've had a tremendous shift over the last 30 years on that front. But where we are really still running into these walls that we're not quite getting past, and so there are a number of roadblocks still that need to be crossed. And one thing, when I've done a series of studies looking at how women are doing in leadership positions in Washington. And one of the things is, you know, we kept hearing from organizations, but this was, of course, a few years ago before Me Too broke, and a lot of these other things have happened that have changed the conversation. But we kept hearing, hey, there's not a problem anymore. We have all these women with masters, PhDs coming out with college degrees. We've got more and more women at the entry level of our organizations, and they're naturally going to move up, and everything's going to be okay, and it's all going to work out. And that was kind of the response that we heard a lot of times from organizations. We look at our numbers of women coming in at the junior level, and that automatically means that they'll get to the senior level. Now, we aren't necessarily seeing that all the time. So especially in male-dominated industries, we're seeing what I call the gender cliff. We've got big numbers of women coming in, and they're coming in and they're on equal footing, and then things happen starting at the mid-level that are kind of they're going off this cliff. They're not necessarily going up into senior management roles. So that is a root issue that we need to start addressing. So what's the result of this? We call it the critical mass problem. So what research indicates is that any group that is in the minority has to crack 30% to actually have a voice that matters to the organization, because under 30% representation either is viewed as sometimes tokenism, like, oh, we needed a woman, or we needed someone from, you know, this group or that, or it is viewed, or those in the minority do not necessarily feel empowered to bring their contributions to the table. So they feel under a lot of pressure to conform to the existing culture, to go with the flow, to not rock the boat. So the organizations are not getting the benefit of that diversity when it doesn't crack the 30%. And so the problem is, in many cases, we are well below 30%. In other cases, we're sort of on the edge of 30%. So we're starting to sort of see that these percentages and numbers not only matter on their face, but they matter in terms of group dynamics in decision-making fora, in board meetings, in these kinds of things. So obviously the CEO level Fortune 500, we're not doing well. Less than 5%, and recent reports indicate we're on a decline. So that's very concerning, and a lot of gender equality advocates are really watching that carefully, those numbers, and trying to figure out what's going on. Less than 12% of board seats. On our political front, which obviously has a huge impact on our industries and so forth, our communities. About 20% of Congress, it kind of goes up and down, 17, 18, 19%, sometimes 21%, depending. It's varied just very slightly around that 20% mark. And then worldwide, about 22.8% of parliamentarians. So we're well below that 30% where really women's voices would make a difference in political decision making. And then we're around 20% in high tech. That's just an overall figure. So it's less depending on what specific company and what level. And then about 11% of leadership positions in Silicon Valley in particular. So these are just some of the statistics. There's many statistics out there about this. So I wanted to sort of try to show you all a little bit about the picture of what's going on. So, why do we have this gender cliff? What's going on? Where are the women disappearing to as they move up the ladder? And so there is a cycle going on. It's self-reinforcing in organizations. So really at the center is this problem of women having very few numbers and being in the minority in these organizations at upper levels. And then it feeds into these other things that kind of come back and continue to feed that minority status. So gender bias and discrimination, obviously, this is, really out there now. It's been blown out of the water with Me Too. A lot of industries are really struggling with this. One thing that I think is interesting to share is when I did my reporting in Washington, I was interviewing women at senior levels and mid-levels of male-dominated national security institutions. And essentially what I was hearing was from those women, they were saying, overt discrimination doesn't happen as much as it used to, mainly because we have legal protections, and a lot of these women work in government. And so because the legal protections were put in place starting in the 70s, women were reporting we're just not necessarily seeing or experiencing the overt discrimination, but we're really experiencing widespread bias. So it was a little bit more, the concern was, how do you grapple with more underlying bias than sort of overt discrimination. Now a number of years later with Me Too and some of the revelations that are coming out about that, even within the national security space and the foreign policy space, I have to wonder if we were even getting the full picture from the women who agreed to be interviewed on a non-attribution basis. I think there is much more discrimination that's going on. I think it was downplayed in our interviews because I think there was a lot of fear. because I think women didn't want to talk publicly about what was really going on in a lot of cases, because again, what I was explaining before, that under 30%, that fear of rocking the boat, that fear of being the crazy, in quotes, the loud, crazy, obnoxious feminist, right? They just wanted to go along with the flow. And so I think actually in hindsight, and from what I'm hearing, is that we actually in our research got a much more, maybe a little bit of a reaction that was not quite exactly what it is. So we're seeing a lot more of that come out. And so that is definitely, obviously we have the sexual harassment problem. So that basket of things, you know, the good news is now there's much more voice around it, and we're actually getting much more of an idea of what's really going on than we were when people were much more afraid to speak up. So that's the positive side of it, but now we have to do something about it. So the other piece is, because women are in the minority, they tend to be very, very concerned about their credibility. In male-dominated organizations, they do not want to risk anything that would affect that credibility. And that definitely has affected gender equality advocacy. What we found is sort of women were willing to maybe go to a certain point, but not to become so vocal that they were really became targets or were ended up penalized within their organizations. So that credibility of, I don't really want to be seen as a woman, I want to be seen as an expert in X. That has been conveyed repeatedly to us. And related to that are some other things I think we see when women are more vulnerable, feeling more vulnerable. They're not as willing, they're self-censoring a bit more. You see that happen. That's the lean in kind of thing, not leaning in or not having your voice completely heard, or being afraid to, have out of the box ideas or things that might not be accepted or encounter resistance. So really self-censoring. No one else is censoring. We're censoring ourselves because we're picking up on what's going on around us in the climate, and we're trying to navigate it. So we can talk more if there's questions, but this factors into the lean in model, where it's a little bit more complicated than just leaning in, because we as women are actually reacting to the climate around us. And then self-elimination. So this also affects like the imposter syndrome, if all of you have heard of this, like, oh, I won't go for that position or that opportunity. I'm not qualified. I don't have one thing on that recruitment list, that list of preferred qualifications. One of those things out of 10 I haven't done, so I am not going to go for that position. That fear that we're not qualified. So that's definitely some of the messages we get. And then we as women don't have as much visibility as experts or leaders. This is all reinforcing. One of the things we can talk about is mentoring and sponsorship. So one of the things that we found is, despite a little bit more of attention on mentoring programs, what women really need is sponsorship. They need higher level people who oftentimes are men to open doors for them, to push for them to get opportunities. That's how it works. And women aren't getting it. So that's a key problem. So they're not on the short list. They're not, in my field, a lot of the pushback, we did a lot of work trying to get more women in very senior roles in the United Nations. And the pushback we got is, oh, the women candidates we get do not have the political gravitas that the men do. So this is like an assumption that women are just not, they're not on those short lists. They're not being viewed as having that extra something, right? And usually that extra something is that they don't look like the people in charge. People naturally want to mentor and sponsor people that look like them. And usually this is white males. So that's what's happening as well there.
Hi,
And
Jillian. It's Dana. Can I jump in for just one quick
yes,
second?
please do. Please do.
So just to touch on to kind of what you've been speaking about around experiences that we all experience. I think some people would like to hear a bit about how women might find or cultivate sponsors, or what strategies they can use to handle the imposter syndrome and things like that. Could you speak a little bit to some solutions?
Yeah, I can. I can speak a little bit about it now, and then later in the presentation, I have some recommendations as well.
Okay, great.
But yes, absolutely. So I think on the sponsorship side, one of the things is that we need to really carefully think about how we're structuring. This is so first the organizational level. We need to think carefully about how we're structuring mentorship programs. Mentorship programs are really valuable, and networking programs and so forth, but we need to probably, I think a lot of times we're sort of on this, a little bit of a check the box kind of thing. Like, okay, we'll throw together this mentoring program, or, we'll do this. And we're not necessarily collecting the best practices from other industries or sectors to create nuanced kinds of programs around that. One thing that I would say is we need to, a lot of the networking and mentoring things, the women's groups are really super important. And I'll talk more about that later, because it gives us, we need to support each other, and it gives us that sense of community, and we're building that community and nurturing each other because we need to have each other's backs. But we also need to engage men, because on the sponsorship side, this is the reality. It's usually going to be men who are key to sponsoring women. So I think that, having more opportunities to bring men into these conversations with us, and talk about what are the best practices in sponsorship. What's worked effectively. And I have to tell you, that information has not been, I think, very usefully collected, but we can collect it as part of these membership organization conversations like yours, and we can collect it within our organizations. And that doesn't need to be a big study. It just needs to be bringing people together and talking through it. So I think a little bit more of these deeper conversations needs to happen, and really thinking through what are women, especially, I think, what is the difference between mentoring someone and sponsoring someone, and what do I need to do to become a sponsor and to be able to do that and make that impact and to be sponsored. So part of it is having conversations and starting to collect what's kind of working in different contexts, and getting beyond just, oh, we'll do this event, or we'll do this and this, check the box. So that's kind of, I can talk more about some of that. And then on the credibility and self-elimination issue, and the self-promotion issues and all that stuff in that box, I think this is one thing where women I've seen really effectively, and I've experienced myself personally, we all struggle with this. This is where I've experienced women can have a powerful impact for other women, because we tend to not speak up for ourselves, and we tend to be very uncomfortable with self-promotion, and we tend to have a lot of self-doubt. And so to have a colleague, or not even a colleague, someone at your sort of equal level in your organization or outside your organization, in your network, more than, who can really speak up for you. And like, for instance, this happens a lot, and I'm seeing it more and more, where women are the whole phenomenon of male panels, right? Where you have a panel of experts and it's all men. And how do we get around that? We have women, pushing for other women to be chosen for those panels. So saying, I know 5 experts and you should pick one of them. So really pushing for our women colleagues, our women within our industries, et cetera, to be recognized. It's easier to accept that from other women than to do it for ourselves. So I've seen that happen quite a bit. The other thing is organizationally on that front, organizations need to be really, really careful about their recruitment and promotion policies. They need to be completely redone in most cases. And we can talk a little bit more about the details of that. But one thing that we found is just the recruitment calls or, job descriptions, are written in a way that is eliminating women or having women eliminate themselves. And those can be rectified. There are ways to do that and approaches that have been used. So I would say on all these fronts, and we'll talk more at the end, but I would say on all these fronts, think about on each thing. I think one of the problems we've had in the past is that we put the burden completely on women's shoulders to solve these issues. And it's not problems of our making. So lean in kind of approaches are part of the solution, but we have actually climate and organizational issues that need to be addressed. And one thing that is, I think, problematic is if we add this on our shoulders of sort of implying we're not doing something right to self-promote, we're not doing something right to lean in, and that's why we're not being successful as women. That's not right, because we have these tendencies, but these tendencies have been fueled by the climate. And so I think we need to think on 2 fronts every time we have one of these root problems we're trying to think about with gender equality. One front is what can I as an individual do? What capacity do I have not only to, advance myself, but help other women advance? And then the other piece is what can I do also to push the organizational change that needs to occur? So not just the individual, but the organization. Until we marry those 2 things together into solutions, we're not gonna solve it. So that's a little bit of on some of those boxes, but I know there's much more to discuss. So please do, if I don't see, I'm not seeing the chat box, so on the slideshow, so please do let me know if there's questions that are coming up and I'll address them as we go for sure. So one other thing I want to bring up is that is the issue of leadership. So when I did my interviews, one of the key things that I think was really causing women, even at senior levels, a lot of angst was leadership approaches and leadership style. And the reason was the dominant leadership styles and the way we've done things in the past, they don't feel authentic to many women. So the models they're seeing, and this was especially true in the national security and these male-dominated fronts with defense, women were sort of saying, what I've seen and experienced, I don't think necessarily works. So they were basically pointing to a problem of a widespread problem of bad leadership and management. And second of all, it's not who I am. And when I try to force myself into those approaches, it's not working for me. So this was causing a lot of just discomfort, and women were looking around for models that they could use. And so I think, and one of the things is that you all have probably heard or experienced this with balancing feminine and masculine, right? So if women are too pushy or too vocal or too aggressive, they're considered bitch, or they're considered very negatively. If they are too consultative and too much, sensitive, then they're considered sort of a wishy-washy, or weak. So they're really trying to navigate these landmines on the leadership side. But what we need to recognize is that the types of leadership we need in the future are very aligned with where women excel naturally. And so I think that where we are now is we're starting to realize that the needs of the world and the needs of our organizations require different types of leadership approaches. And that's an opening for women not to have to force ourselves in those boxes, but to just really just be confident in these competencies that come naturally to us. So I wanted to, this is a little bit outside your industry, but if any of you have heard of Anne-Marie Slaughter, she became very well known for that article in the Atlantic about 5 years ago on having it all. She was a very senior advisor to Hillary Clinton in the State Department. And she quit. It was her dream job. And she has written a lot. She's spoken a lot if you've seen her around. But she wrote a recent book because she's also a very well-respected foreign policy scholar on a networked world that we're in. And the fact is that because we're in a networked world, we are going to need different approaches, and it's all relationship-based. So the hierarchies of the past are starting to just not work very well for the problems that we're dealing with. We're going to need much more collaboration and different types of experiences coming to the table and team-based approaches. And there's another woman that you may be interested in. She's actually here in California. Her name's Rianne Eisler, and she's written for a long time on sort of these different models and this partnership model that I think is very resonates with gender equality and why that's so important for the world. The other thing that I found interesting recently, out of Stanford, the Peace Innovation Lab did a big study on online networking patterns, and they found that women really excelled, and we all know this, but that women, so it's not just in-person relationship building, it's online as well. So women are really poised to take more leadership positions in this world we are in that is networked. So that's kind of where we are, and I think it's a bigger issue about what kinds of leadership we need for the future. And it's a positive picture, I think, for where women can really contribute. So here we are. This is where we are. Where do we go from here? And I think that one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is really, in many ways, we've been treating symptoms, or we've been putting on a Band-Aid on some of the issues that have bubbled up on gender equality. But really, this is our juncture now to start really putting much more effort in addressing the root causes of what we're seeing. So we tend to focus, like the numbers I showed, the percentages on one of the very first slides. We focus a lot on parity. It is important, like I was saying, for that critical mass. But because we oftentimes sort of fixate on these numbers and we're like, how do we just get the numbers up? How do we just get the numbers up, right? But what that's missing is everything that's underneath that's causing those numbers to be that way. So we really need to take a much more holistic and comprehensive approach to this. So I have a few broad recommendation areas, and we can certainly talk about more specifics. But number one, and this is also on my mind because I just interviewed about 75 senior level men in peace and security who are promoting gender equality, like really vocally, about why they're doing it. And so it's on my mind right now that one of the things that we really, as a gender equality community, as organizations trying to promote women, we just haven't paid enough attention to how are we going to engage men as allies? How are we going to bring women and men together for this? Because as you heard on sponsorship, on the numbers and the decision-making tables and making sure that it's inclusive, we can't do this without men. We need to support each other, but we need men to be part of this process. So we have now mandates, laws, policies. We could always use more, certainly. We've started there. We have somewhat of a foundation in many places, but really where we are, the juncture we're at now, which is a lot, actually, I think harder, is changing our values, our norms, and our behaviors. And that's what it's going to really take to achieve gender equality. And so to do that, we need allies, we need champions within our organizations, and we need champions outside of our organizations. So we need push and pull. We need people pulling in the gender equality conversations into their organizations, and we need people on the outside pushing it in. And so we need to figure out ways to engage those champions. And one thing that if men are fully engaged in this, one thing that it can do is it can really change that perception that when we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about a women's issue. And every time it gets placed in that box, guess what? It gets at the bottom. And so having men as part of this conversation and men also vocalizing how important this is gets us out of that women's issue box and starts helping people to understand that gender equality is about helping all of us. It's about having more inclusive climates, respectful climates. It's about harnessing all of our talent that we have, all of our human capacity. And I think once we get over that hump and have more of a picture of gender equality that includes both men and women, we'll make more progress as well. So we need to find more ways to have that dialogue for sure. Before I move on, I'm sort of seeing some things pop up. Nicole or Dana or Chitra, were there any questions that you're seeing that I should address now, or do you want me to keep going?
I think you can keep going. I think we have a couple good ones. I think that'll be nice at the end.
Perfect. Okay. So the second thing that I think is really, really important is to start to really make sure we're gathering the data and we're doing the analysis. And what's missing a lot of times in our conversations about gender equality is there's expertise on this. This is a field of study. And I think a lot of times because of these assumptions around this being a women's issue or this or that, we think in organizations, there's sort of the thought of like, oh, we'll just do this or this. It's that check the box kind of thing, right? And that we as women are going to be automatic experts on this. Well, not necessarily. Actually, men and women are gender equality experts. There's many men I've interviewed who work on gender, and that's what they have competencies around dealing with this. So we need to get out of that thought that like this can kind of be things can be thrown to address this because, we have women, let's have a woman plan something, fine. But we need to put more scientific and expertise into our solutions. And so we need to understand, first of all, we won't ever understand what our problems are unless we're adequately collecting the data. So we do much, much better job about that. There's a huge paucity of data right now in organizations. And a lot of times it's definitely hard to get to because the picture's not good. So a real reluctance to share that. So really pushing for transparency so that we can work together to address. As I said, not just parity. So not just, okay, let's get our numbers up. That's a short-term solution. We need to think about every single stage of our decision-making, every part of our organizations. What does this look like? Do we have gender sensitivity? Are we building competency to ask the right questions among our employees? Basic questions. Why aren't there any women at the table? Are women being heard less than men? Are women having a fair shot at these promotions, etc.? And we need to recognize that our decisions affect women and men differently. So we need to get beyond the idea that we're all the same the same in the workforce. We all have the same motivators. We all have the same. We're not the same. We're part of a social structure outside of work. And then I wanted to bring to your attention, there are tools, and we can use these tools and experts. One example is the city of San Francisco incorporated a international treaty called the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women into their city planning. And it's a really interesting case study if you want to know more about it. So there are these innovative solutions. And then, of course, the big one, right? The huge one that we're hearing about all the time, gender bias and abuse. So one thing that we know now is big problem of unconscious bias going on. Everyone has it. It's shaped by how we grew up and what we see around us. So we need to pay a lot of attention to unconscious bias, and there's a lot of trainings out there, and there's a lot of things happening on that front which we can utilize. Messaging from the top, obviously, we still live in a hierarchical world. What leaders say and their actions make a difference. And so we need to start working on that at all levels. And then we have to gender audit all of our processes. So a big problem is there are landmines in our recruitment and promotion processes. We need better evaluation, accountability, etc. So I can talk more about all this stuff, but there's a lot of like very specific things we can do. Building a mentoring culture, right? So mentoring starts from day one. You can be an intern and mentor students. You can be a junior level professional and mentor interns. You do not need to be in the C-suite to be a mentor. We can have peer mentors, which are very, very powerful and helpful for us. So it's 360. It's all around. We need to be thinking about how can we mentor others and how can we be mentored all the time. And formal mentoring programs are important. They're not sufficient. So we need to have those in place as a starting point. They get it on everyone's minds, but a lot of mentoring is very organic. So we need to create institutions and cultures that really nurture that. And then what you all do in this membership organization, very important, right? Networking, relationship building. This is very powerful. I ran a membership organization for 8 years, and I know how powerful it is, and I know the difference it makes. So being part of this membership is step one. We'll talk a little bit more about sponsorship, and we need to focus much more about it as well. So and the thing is just prioritizing this. So kind of coming full circle, right back to the beginning, is that we know the evidence is there about just how important this is. So now we need to actually act like it's important. And unfortunately, a lot of gender equality initiatives are resource starved. Women are multi-hatted in terms of leadership will say, oh, you're a woman, you deal with this gender equality thing, right? And so the thing is that those that are leading these efforts oftentimes on the inside just aren't being given that authority, and so forth. So we have some best practices around that as well, but we really need to make sure that we are putting the force of the organizations and the resources of the organizations behind it. And lastly, I would make a plea that we need to get outside of our silos as well. So we need to, meet others. We need to talk about this. And this will give us an opportunity to identify practices that we can apply in our own lives and that we can push our organizations to apply. So I'll end there, and then we can, then I'm happy to field questions that you all have.
Great. Thank you so much, Jolyn. This is Dana. I think from some of the questions that are coming in, I think what people would really like to know, for example, and maybe, I know you touched upon a lot of these, but in a detailed way, are there a couple strategies that you can recommend that people could use now to push for organizational change? So I think for someone who's attending this or listens to this webinar another day, what can they do after lunch today for the organization?
I mean, I think so, absolutely. And this is the time where it's on everyone's minds and leadership can't ignore it anymore. And so one of the things that I think everyone can do is, I think that there's a lot of confusion right now and stress around Me Too, right? So that we had this like unleashing of all of these like pent up things that people hadn't been able to get out into the limelight. But now people are like, what's next? Like, how do we function now? And I think that one thing that everyone can do is that organizations would really appreciate, as well as leaders, is bringing constructive things to the table. And one of the constructive things to the table is sort of say, there's some things we can do from day one. One, we can create fora for discussions. So let's start having not accusations, not, but let's have discussions with men and women about what are we grappling with. So one of the things that we always say in policy making and public policy making is you can't make effective policy if you don't talk to your stakeholders. Right? You've got to talk to your stakeholders, and you've got to talk to all of them. And one of the problems has been in public policy that we don't hear from the women in the women's groups a lot of times. And so we can correct that now in organizations. We can start bringing together, and this will be context specific. So sometimes we may want to have a two-front. Okay, we're going to get together some women to talk about, what are we grappling with, or what are our priorities as women in this company, in this organization. And then we can expand or bring in men as well, for women and men to discuss that as well, and start identifying from the ground up, start giving voice to what the issues are. And I think that is something that can be very informal. It could be, hey, let's have a brown bag lunch, right? Or it can be a formal thing. So you have to decide based on your organization and what your leadership is interested in. But I think that just starting the dialogue is a step in the right direction. So that's one thing that could definitely be done from day one. Also, I think not in a very inquiry kind of way. You could ask your organizations, listen, how are we collecting data on what's happening with gender equality in our organization? Are we collecting it? And that data would be really helpful for us to try to work together to address some of the gaps. So, I think pushing that in a way that works for you as an individual in your organization, just inquiring, are we collecting data, gender disaggregated data, and learning a little bit about, thinking a little bit about recommendations for your leadership on recruitment and promotion and evaluation, and what maybe could be done, which might help women, and so just, I think, start as an individual, we can all start these conversations organizationally. And the second thing I would say that's a little bit more personally is really be proactive on trying to mentor other women in your organization. And you can do that today, whether you supervise that person or you have another linkage, just reach out. Hey, let's have lunch. Let's have coffee. Let's talk about what's going on. So I think that sometimes on the mentee side, especially junior level, it's intimidating. And so I think sometimes those women hold back, but those of us who are upper level professionals can reach down and sort of offer that. And I think, that could be done as well. And I think those are starting points, just a few starting points that could be done today.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know we're just a couple minutes over time. Just one more thing that I think might be another kind of tangible item that people can take with them. Are there any specific organizations or networks, like some names that you could rattle off that people could kind of get involved with that might kind of help push the needle around this topic? across
Yeah.
all the different organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, and I recognize it is really difficult to like tap into the resources that are there. And I mean, most of the organizations I work with are a little bit more focused on the, you know, I would say the policy side. So, but I think, you know, one thing that I know have been active in various places are these lean in circles. And I think that if you start one, look on the leanin.org page. If you start one or there's already one existing in your area, those are good mechanisms because they are hosting discussions and so forth. And it's broader than just your organization. So that might be one way to tap in a little bit into what's going on. And I think the other thing is, you know, and this is related too. I mean, I think you can make your own effort. So I'll give you an example. When I worked at the Pentagon, very male dominated, and you know, those of us women really were feeling isolated because it was a crazy time and it was a lot of pressure. And we formed our own group within the Pentagon, within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And we just started getting a conference room and meeting for lunch, you know. And then after I left and I was running an organization that worked a lot with women in these institutions. We used to go and guest speak at those lunches. So those became a thing, and more women kind of joined that group just to get together for lunch. And don't underestimate it. It's just to have that ability to have a safe space to talk through the issues and to think strategically together about what constructively could be done in your organization is really helpful. You all know, obviously, LinkedIn is a great source to sort of see what's going on with different groups, online groups, and so forth. So it's a time where I think it's hard to rattle off because also with Me Too, there's so much activism starting. So it's so I think it just takes a little bit of looking around for established groups that might exist that would be relevant to you. And then if there's no established groups, this is your time to leverage your informal network and start your own group of some sort. It doesn't need to be called anything, just support each other. And that's where it starts.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We are out of time, a little bit over. So thank you, everybody. Any of these other questions I did see come in, I will send to Jolynn, and we'll get, you know, some answers. And obviously we want to keep this conversation going. So thank you so much, Jolynn, Women Empowerment Chapter Leadership. Thank you very much. As a reminder, all these webinars are recorded and uploaded on IOP.org. So if you want to share this with any colleagues who couldn't make it, please feel free to do so. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.